Desperation makes you take jobs you would normally drive right past without a second glance. I was a broke grad student buried in loan debt, and my ancient sedan had just blown a head gasket right before the worst Montana winter in a decade. So, when I saw the night auditor wanted sign taped to the frosted window of the Glacier Pines Motor Lodge, I didn't care that the neon vacancy sign buzzed like an angry hornet or that the place looked like a forgotten relic from the 1970s. The motel sat just off a lonely stretch of Interstate 90, surrounded by miles of dense, unforgiving pine forest, and currently being buried under 2 feet of snow. The owner, a perpetually sweating man named Henderson, hired me on the spot, handed me a scratchy uniform polo, and told me my shift started at midnight. "It's easy money, kid," he coughed, already putting on his heavy winter coat to leave before the roads became entirely impassable. "Lock the lobby doors at 1 a.m., keep the coffee fresh for the truckers, and whatever you do, don't fall asleep." Before Henderson rushed out the door into the howling blizzard, he tapped a frayed, leather-bound notebook sitting next to the ancient computer terminal. "Marcus, the guy you're replacing, left this behind. He was a good worker, but his head wasn't screwed on quite right toward the end. He wrote down some procedures for the night shift. Read it if you get bored, but don't take it too seriously. Kid had an active imagination." With a dismissive wave, Henderson was gone, leaving me completely alone in the dimly lit lobby. The silence of the snowstorm outside was absolute, pressing against the large glass windows like a physical weight. I settled into the worn office chair behind the front desk, poured myself a cup of burnt, lukewarm coffee, and stared at the empty parking lot. There were only 3 cars parked outside, snow rapidly piling up on their windshields. It was going to be a long, mind-numbing night. By 2 a.m., the boredom had become a physical ache. I had reorganized the brochures, cleaned the coffee pots, and scrolled through my phone until the battery hit 20%. Desperate for any kind of distraction, my eyes landed on the leather-bound notebook Marcus had left behind. I pulled it across the desk, the cover stiff and smelling faintly of mildew and old tobacco. The first few pages were exactly what you'd expect. Instructions on how to reboot the ancient credit card machine, where the extra toilet paper was kept, and the phone number for the local tow truck company. But as I flipped further into the book, the handwriting drastically changed. The neat printed letters devolved into an erratic, rushed scrawl. The ink pressed so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. At the top of page 4, heavily underlined in red ink, was the heading, "The Real Rules for the Night Shift." I leaned back in my chair, expecting a creative prank left for the new guy, a hazing ritual to spook the rookie. I started to read. Rule 1. Lock the front doors at 1 a.m. Do not unlock them for anyone, even if they show you a room key. The people staying here already have access to their rooms. The things knocking on the glass are not our guests. I chuckled nervously, looking up at the locked double doors leading out to the snowy parking lot. Rule 2. At 2:30 a.m. you will hear someone walking on the roof. Do not look up, keep your eyes on the desk, it hates being perceived. I checked my watch. It was 2:45 a.m. I hadn't heard anything on the roof, which only confirmed my theory that Marcus was either pulling my leg or experiencing a severe psychological break. I turned the page, the rules becoming increasingly specific and bizarre. Rule 3. If the ice machine in the breezeway starts making a grinding noise that sounds like crushing wet bones, immediately duck under the front desk and cover your ears. Do not look at the security cameras. Wait until the sound stops. I shook my head, closing the notebook. It was a good creepypasta, I'd give him that, but I wasn't about to spend my first night jumping at shadows. I stood up to stretch my legs, looking out at the blizzard. The snow was falling so heavily now that the nearest streetlights were just blurry orange halos in the whiteout. I felt completely isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, just me and a few sleeping truckers weathering the storm. I sat back down and glanced at the digital clock on the computer monitor. It was 3:14 a.m. I picked up the notebook again, morbidly curious to see what other insane rules Marcus had invented. My eyes scanned down to Rule 4. Rule 4. We do not rent out room 7. It is permanently out of order. If the switchboard lights up and shows an incoming call from room 7 at exactly 3:15 a.m., You must answer it. But whatever you do, do not speak. Do not breathe into the receiver. Hold it to your ear and listen until they hang up. If they hear you breathing, they will know you are alone." I scoffed, tossing the notebook back onto the desk. "Room 7, I muttered to myself. I glanced at the registration screen. Room 7 was indeed marked as out-of-order plumbing. I reached for my coffee mug, ready to dismiss the whole thing, when a sharp electronic buzzing shattered the silence of the lobby. I jumped, spilling hot coffee onto my wrist. I looked down at the ancient phone console. The red light next to extension 7 was flashing frantically. I slowly turned my head to look at the clock on the computer monitor. The numbers glared back at me in the dim light. 3:15 a.m. The red light on the console blinked in rhythm with my hammering heart. 3:15 a.m. Room 7. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a coincidence, a prank set up by Henderson or Marcus to haze the new guy. But the sheer terror I felt was primal, overriding all logic. The phone kept ringing, a harsh, demanding buzz that seemed to grow louder with each repetition. My hand trembled uncontrollably as I reached out and lifted the receiver, pressing it tightly against my ear. I remembered Rule 4. Do not speak. Do not breathe. I pinched my nose shut with my free hand and clamped my jaw tight, holding my breath until my lungs burned. At first, there was only dead silence on the other end, a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt like being underwater. Then, faint sounds began to emerge from the static. It wasn't a voice. It sounded wet and rhythmic, like someone slowly stirring a pot of thick stew, interspersed with soft clicking noises that sounded disturbingly like teeth snapping together. The sounds were quiet, intimate, as if the person, or thing, on the other end was holding the phone right up to their mouth. I stared at the second hand on the wall clock, ticking away agonizingly slowly. 30 seconds passed. My vision started to spot at the edges from lack of oxygen. Just as I thought I was going to pass out and gasp for air, the line clicked dead. The dial tone returned loud and jarring. I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle, gasping for air, my body shaking so violently I nearly fell out of the chair. I stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. That hadn't been a prank call. There was no laughter, no gotcha moment. Just those awful wet sounds from an empty room. I grabbed the computer mouse and frantically refreshed the registration screen, desperate for it to show that someone had checked into room 7 by mistake. It still read, "Out of order plumbing." I grabbed the leather notebook again, no longer treating it as a joke. It was now my survival guide. I flipped past the pages I had already read, my eyes scanning the erratic handwriting for what was coming next. The rules were getting more specific and more terrifying. Rule 7. The vending machine on the second floor balcony does not accept quarters. It only accepts teeth. Do not try to buy a snack. Rule 8. If you see a little girl in a yellow raincoat standing by the ice machine, do not offer her help. She is not lost. She is bait. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of burnt coffee in my throat. I was trapped in a blizzard miles from civilization, in a building that seemed to operate on nightmare logic. Around 4 a.m., the wind outside picked up, howling around the eaves of the lodge like a wounded animal. The snow was piling up fast against the large plate glass windows of the lobby, creating a sense of crushing isolation. I was trying to distract myself by organizing key cards when a sudden, dull thump against the front doors made me jump nearly out of my skin. I looked up, my heart leaping into my throat. Through the swirling snow and frost-covered glass, I could see a figure standing just outside the locked double doors. It was a person, bundled in a heavy snow-covered parka, hunched over against the cold. They raised a gloved fist and banged weakly on the glass again. "Help!" A muffled voice cried out over the roar of the wind. "Please let me in! My car slid off the road! I'm freezing!" My immediate instinct, the human instinct, was to grab the keys and rush to the door. This was a stranded traveler, someone who could die of hypothermia within minutes if I didn't help. I stood up, grabbing the large brass ring of keys from under the counter. I took 2 steps toward the door before I froze. The notebook was lying open on the desk, and Marcus's frantic handwriting seemed to burn into my peripheral vision. I remembered Rule 1, the very first rule I had dismissed as a joke. Lock the front doors at 1 a.m. Do not unlock them for anyone. The things knocking on the glass are not our guests. I stopped in the middle of the lobby, caught in an agonizing dilemma. If I followed the rule, I might be leaving an innocent person to freeze to death. If I broke the rule, I might be letting something horrific inside. The figure outside banged again, harder this time, their face pressed against the glass, obscured by a frosted ski mask and goggles. "Open the door. What is wrong with you? I'm going to die out here." The voice sounded desperate, human. I stepped closer to the glass, trying to get a better look, my hand clutching the keys so tightly the metal bit into my palm. "I'm sorry," I shouted through the glass, my voice shaking. "I can't unlock the door right now. I can call the highway patrol for you." The figure stopped banging instantly. The desperate posture vanished. They stood up straight, too straight, their movements suddenly fluid and unnatural. They leaned in closer to the glass and slowly reached up to pull down the ski mask. I braced myself, expecting to see a frostbitten face, angry and scared. The mask pulled away. There was no face. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin like dough that hadn't been molded yet. No features, just a blank surface. I stumbled backward, dropping the keys with a loud clatter on the tile floor. The thing outside pressed its featureless head against the glass, and I heard a sound come through the door, muffled but distinct. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was the same wet, clicking sound I had heard on the phone from room 7. I scrambled backward so fast my chair tipped over, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty lobby. The faceless entity at the glass doors didn't bang again. It simply stood there for a long, agonizing moment, the wet clicking noise vibrating against the frosted panes before turning and dissolving back into the swirling whiteout of the blizzard. I stayed on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, my breathing ragged and shallow, waiting for the sound of shattering glass. But the lobby remained intact, the only sound the howling wind outside. I crawled back to the front desk and blindly felt for the leather-bound notebook, pulling it down to the floor with me. I was no longer a skeptical grad student. I was a true believer, terrified and desperate to survive until dawn. My eyes darted across the pages, searching for whatever horror was scheduled next in this snowy purgatory. The digital clock on the edge of the desk glowed 4:27 a.m. I had survived the call from room 7 and the visitor at the door, but my nerves were entirely frayed. I read the next entry, my finger tracing the deeply indented ink. Rule 5. At exactly 5 a.m., the lobby phone will ring. It will sound like Henderson checking in on you. Ask him what his wife's name is. If he says Margaret, it is safe to talk. If he says Mary, hang up the phone immediately and do not look up at the ceiling. Just stare at your shoes until 6 a.m. I repeated the names in my head. Margaret is safe, Mary is bad, don't look up. It seemed simple enough, a bizarre password system for a shape-shifting nightmare. I forced myself off the floor, righted my chair, and sat back down, keeping my eyes glued to the clock. The minutes crawled by like hours, the silence of the motel pressing against my eardrums. At 4:45 a.m., a new sound began to emanate from the breezeway hallway that connected the lobby to the ground floor rooms. It started as a low mechanical hum, but quickly escalated into a violent, shuddering grind. It was the ice machine, but it didn't sound like it was dropping ice cubes. It sounded like a massive industrial wood chipper trying to chew through thick, wet logs. There was a sickening crunch, snap, squelch rhythm to it that made my stomach churn. I remembered Marcus's frantic warning from Rule 3. If the ice machine sounds like crushing wet bones, duck under the front desk. Cover your ears. Do not look at the security cameras. I didn't hesitate. I dove under the desk, curling into a tight ball in the dusty space next to the computer tower, and clamped my hands over my ears. Even muffled, the horrific grinding vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the dust from the underside of the desk. I closed my eyes tight, humming to myself to drown out the noise, praying for it to end. After 10 agonizing minutes, The grinding shuddered to a halt, replaced by the normal, quiet hum of the compressor. I waited another full minute before slowly sliding out from under the desk, my muscles cramped and aching. The lobby was empty. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a tiny sliver of triumph. I was doing it. I was following the rules, and I was surviving. I checked the clock, 4:58 a.m., 2 minutes until the phone call. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead and rested my hand on the receiver, repeating the names like a mantra. Margaret is good. Mary is bad. The second the clock flipped to 5 a.m., the phone blared to life, the ringtone sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I picked it up on the second ring, my knuckles white. "Glacier Pines Motor Lodge," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound professional. "Hey, kid, it's Henderson." The gruff, familiar voice of my boss crackled through the receiver. The relief that washed over me was intoxicating. It sounded exactly like him. The slight wheeze, the impatience, the background static of a bad cell connection in a storm. "Just calling to make sure you haven't frozen to death or locked yourself out. How's the shift going?" I almost blurted out that I was terrified, that monsters were knocking on the doors, but I stopped myself. The rule, I had to verify. It's going fine, Mr. Henderson. Just a quick question, though. What's your wife's name?" There was a slight pause on the line, just long enough to make my heart skip a beat. Then, Henderson chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "What kind of question is that, kid? You hit your head? My wife's name is Mary. Now about the receipts." Mary. The name dropped into my stomach like a block of lead. It wasn't him. I didn't let the thing finish its sentence. I slammed the receiver down onto the cradle with a violent clatter, severing the connection. I had done it right. I had hung up. But in my sheer panic, the sudden adrenaline spike overriding my rational brain, human reflex betrayed me. I had just been told an explicit, unnatural command not to do something, and my terrified mind instantly rebelled. Before I could stop myself, before I could remember the second half of Marcus's frantic warning, I tilted my head back and looked straight up at the ceiling. My eyes darted upward, disobeying the very rule that was meant to keep me safe. The ceiling above the front desk was made of cheap, water-stained acoustic tiles, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes. But right directly above my chair, a cluster of 4 tiles had been pushed aside, revealing the dark, cavernous crawl space of the motel's attic. Clinging to the exposed wooden beams and the edges of the drop ceiling was a creature that defied any natural anatomy. It was horrifyingly pale, its skin the color of old chalk, and it consisted of too many long, double-jointed limbs folded spider-like against the rafters. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, doughy expanse of skin, but as my eyes locked onto it, a vertical slit split open down the center of its head, revealing rows of translucent, needle-like teeth clicking together wetly. It was the source of the sounds from the Room 7 phone call, and because I had looked up, it knew exactly where I was. The moment our eyes, or rather, my eyes and its terrible, blind gaze, met, the creature let out a sound like a high-voltage wire snapping in the rain. It uncoiled its limbs with terrifying speed and dropped from the ceiling, landing heavily on the front desk right where my coffee mug had been sitting. The cheap wood of the desk splintered under its weight. I didn't scream. My vocal cords were completely paralyzed by a terror so pure it felt like ice water in my veins. I scrambled backward, kicking my desk chair into the creature's massive limbs, and bolted for the only secure room I knew of, the manager's back office. I vaulted over the half door of the reception area, my boots slipping on the linoleum, hearing the sickening thump, thump, thump of the entity scrambling over the counter right behind me. I threw my weight against the solid core steel door of Henderson's office, twisting the heavy deadbolt shut just a fraction of a second before a massive concussive force slammed into the other side. The metal door buckled slightly, dust raining down from the door frame, but the lock held. I backed away, pressing my spine against the filing cabinets at the far end of the tiny windowless room, sliding down to the floor in the dark. For the next hour, The thing on the other side of the door unleashed a psychological assault that nearly broke my mind. It didn't just pound on the metal. It started to speak. It used Henderson's voice, begging me to let him in because he was freezing. Then it used the voice of the stranded traveler from the front doors, crying in agony. But the worst part was when it used a voice I had never heard before, a frantic, exhausted voice of a young man. "Please, I'm Marcus." The voice wept through the bottom gap of the door. "I just wanted to quit. I just wanted to go home. You looked up. You weren't supposed to look up. Now it knows your face. Now you have to take my place." I clamped my hands over my ears, biting my lip until it bled to keep from making a single sound, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years that the steel door would hold. The digital clock on Henderson's desk, glowing a faint green in the darkness, mocked me as the minutes crawled by. 5:20 a.m. 5:45 a.m. 5:58 a.m. The scratching and weeping on the other side of the door were relentless, a continuous loop of auditory torture. And then, at exactly 6 a.m., the alarm on my wristwatch beeped. Instantly, the noises outside the door ceased. There was no retreating footstep, no sound of something climbing back into the ceiling. It was just gone, replaced by the muffled, distant sound of a heavy snowplow scraping the asphalt of the interstate. I sat there in the dark for another 30 minutes, completely catatonic, until I heard the unmistakable jingle of keys and the heavy metallic clank of the lobby's front doors being unlocked. "Hey kid, you survived the night?" Henderson's booming voice echoed through the lobby, followed by the stomping of his snow-covered boots. "Storms broke. Roads are getting cleared up." I slowly stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and unlocked the deadbolt. I pushed the steel door open and stepped out into the lobby. The morning sun was reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow outside, bathing the room in harsh, unforgiving light. The front desk was a wreck. My chair was broken, the computer monitor was cracked, and the acoustic tiles above were scattered across the floor. Henderson stopped in his tracks, taking off his winter hat, his face turning purple with anger. "What the hell happened here? Did you throw a party or something? Look at my ceiling." I didn't answer him. I didn't care about my final paycheck, my blown head gasket, or my student loans. I walked past him in a complete daze, heading straight for the front doors. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Henderson yelled, grabbing my arm. I yanked it free with a ferocity that made him step back. "I quit," I whispered, my voice sounding like crushed glass. I walked out into the freezing morning air, heading toward the idling snowplow in the parking lot to beg for a ride into town. But before I reached the truck, I reached into my jacket pocket to grab my phone. My fingers brushed against something stiff and unfamiliar. I pulled it out, my blood running cold. It was the leather-bound notebook. I hadn't put it in my pocket. I opened it with trembling hands, flipping past Marcus's frantic scrawls all the way to the very last page. There, written in fresh red ink, in handwriting that looked exactly like my own, was a brand new entry. Rule 6. The new guy looked up. He broke the rules. Now, he belongs to the night shift. We will see him tomorrow at midnight. I dropped the notebook in the snow and ran toward the highway, knowing with absolute certainty that no matter how far I traveled, I would never sleep in the dark again.